Welcome in. I'm Austin Westfall. The October 7th attack has been a key focus of our coverage for the past year. It started with Hamas and other Palestinian militant groups breaking through the Gaza-Israel barrier that day, massacring over 1,000 Israelis and taking hundreds more hostage. The surprise terrorist attack stunning the world, igniting an increasingly complex war that's already ugly and has bred an unwavering fear that it could still get bigger and uglier. In addition to the Israelis that were brutally murdered on October 7th, tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians are dead in Gaza. The death toll is rising in Lebanon as well. Those deaths coming as collateral damage as the IDF makes real progress, crippling two of its biggest regional terrorist foes, Iran-backed Hamas and Hezbollah. It's impossible to recount every nuanced detail of the past 12 months and the history behind that, but I know someone who does a pretty damn close job. Alon Burstein. He's a researcher, visiting assistant professor, and Israel Institute fellow at Tufts University. And aside from those directly involved in the war, he knows this conflict closer than anyone I know. We're going to go long today. This won't go on TV. We're taping this off air so that we can go as long as we want, talking October 2023 to October 2024 alone. Let's get into it. There's a lot to cover, as always. So, the Washington Post reported that on October 7th, instructions found on dead Hamas fighters included kill as many people and take as many hostages as possible. Why did they do this alone? Why did Hamas feel the need to carry out such a grisly attack, even when they had to have known that it would prompt a major response from the Israelis?
So thank you for having me on this special segment on this unfortunate anniversary. It's obviously a big question, and we have to look at it from two perspectives. We have to look from the macro Hamas perspective and also the more micro tactical perspective. On the macro, Hamas is an organization that has branded itself as both jihadist and Palestinian. Their official charter says that they combine both along with an Arab identity. Their main objective, the destruction of Israel and the establishment of an Islamic Palestinian state. Those two things are important because that is what sets it apart from the nationalistic Palestinians, that they just want a Palestinian state, or the more, classic radical jihadists like ISIS that just want an Islamic state. They want an Islamic Palestinian state. That is their sort of unique brand. On the overall macro ideology, that is what fuels their attempts for years on end to continue the struggle against Israel, this overarching goal. That, has to be taken as a given. At the same time, Hamas took over the Gaza Strip in 2007 and has proven that despite this overarching ideology, they're not just knife between the teeth going to carry out an attack every day. They're very, very strategic. They monitor all of Israel's activities. They try to figure out what is the right moment to strike and how are they going to strike. Seemingly, in trying to carry out or in carrying out this massive attack, they wanted to achieve several things. First, they wanted to redivert the world's attention to the Palestinian situation. There's been absolutely no progress on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict since basically 2007, and even then, it was only a conference that had a lot of statements and got nowhere, and the Palestinian issue has largely been forgotten throughout the world. It used to be the focus of the world for a long time, focus of different peacemaking initiatives. It has been forgotten. The Abraham Accords is probably the biggest illustration of this, the attempt to completely sideline the Palestinian issue. Hamas wanted to refocus the world back on the Palestinian issue. That's one. Another thing they wanted to do is they wanted to strengthen themselves in a bid to start to challenge the Palestinian Authority, which is led by the more nationalistic Palestine Liberation Organization. They wanted to challenge them in a bid to, at some point, start to take over the West Bank. That's two. A third thing, they wanted to kidnap a lot of Israelis in order to secure the release of Palestinian prisoners. I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later. Palestinian prisoners that are held in Israel, Hamas wanted to kidnap Israelis in order to secure their release. And probably one of the biggest things, number four, they wanted to bring about a situation where they can end the siege on Gaza. Ever since 2007, when Hamas took over the Gaza Strip, it has been under siege by Israel and Egypt carrying out sieges from land, sea, and air. And this, while we see that Hamas has managed to build itself up in many ways, has still prevented it from thriving as much as it would like to in the region, from having its influence on the West Bank. And it's no surprise that part of their ongoing negotiations right now include a demand for an end to the siege and never having it return, and having international guarantees that Israel cannot impose such a siege. So macro, destruction of Israel and the desire to bring about a different situation in that land. Micro tactical, a lot of smaller things that were meant to resolve more immediate issues that they're focused on.
I want to take a look at this satellite image. This is showing the burn scar outside of Gaza. These are all those communities that were impacted by the initial attack. So, the attack happening on the 7th catches Israel completely off guard. Alone. What do we know about how Hamas did this under the radar and how Israeli intelligence failed that day?
So Hamas did this, very, very intelligently. I have been studying Hamas for, 15 years probably, and I didn't think that they were going to be able to pull off something like this despite all of their training. One of the things they did, Israel invested a monumental amount of money in what they called an underground sort of wall, essentially, but it's more an array of sensors, in order to try to stop Hamas from building tunnels that Hamas started to build in 2014 to invade Israel underground and catch all these kibbutzim or different Israeli towns off guard. And then Israel invested a hell of a lot in technology. Most of the fence around the Gaza Strip was monitored by cameras, monitored by drones, monitored by AI, monitored by a lot of different things that the IDF was relying on. All of that failed in a very catastrophic way because Hamas planned. They planned very well. One of the things that they did in the first moments of the attack, they sent out their own drones, and each one of them dropped bombs or suicide drones crashed into the cameras that the IDF had, and instantly the IDF was blind along the fence. Another thing that they did is they completely abandoned the attempt to try to break through the underground barrier that Israel had created. Instead of that, they actually carried out the entire attack above ground, which Israel was not expecting. The entire attack was done above ground. We have these, big images of tractors pulling through the fence, and they managed to catch Israel completely off guard on that front as well. One of the things, though, the big failure on Israeli intelligence was more a belief that Hamas was not interested in this. One of the concepts, it's often referred in Israel to as the concept that Israel was sort of stuck in, was the idea that once Hamas took over the Gaza Strip, they are more interested in governance. They're more interested in enjoying the pleasures of being in charge, which involves also a lot of money going into the leadership's pockets, and that they actually, despite all their rhetoric, despite the building up of arms, despite the training that they were constantly doing at the fence, including up until a few days before the attack, it's all for show. It's not actually something that they're going to engage in because they'd much rather hold on to their regime. So that is the big intelligence failure. It's not so much in not seeing the buildup. The buildup was there. It was being monitored. It was being watched all the time. There was a belief that they are not interested in such a war and in such an escalation anymore, and that is really what came crashing down. One more thing I'll say about the way they carried it out, and in this sense, it's also important to note that Hamas itself was actually caught by surprise at how unprepared the IDF was. According to the testimony of different Nukhba fighters, the Nukhba are the Hamas commandos who went in the first waves. According to their own testimony, the ones who were captured, they blew holes in anywhere between 15 and 80 places along the fence and sent in waves of attacks, which is not that strategic. You could concentrate your forces in one area. The reason was they fully expected the IDF to be waiting for them. They said our expectation was that the IDF tanks are going to be there. This is the mighty Israeli Defense Forces. They must know our plans. They expected that to happen, so they were trying to spread their forces as thin as possible in order to try to find, okay, so where's a weak spot? Where's one place that a unit managed to get through, and therefore channel your forces to there. They did not expect the entire defense array of the IDF to come crashing down. That, to some extent, also helps us understand what happened with regards to the amount of people that they kidnapped. Hamas was not thinking that it is going to be this successful in kidnapping as many people as well. As you said, in your first question, their orders were kill as many people as you can, kidnap as many people as you can. The expectation was that only a few units are going to get through. They did not expect to have that many people coming back, which is one of the reasons that Hamas agreed to terms that are very different than they are now. In November, Hamas needed to get rid of some of the hostages. They actually were not planning on holding so many hostages for so long. So all those things came together on October 7th. Really, the cataclysmic failure of Israeli intelligence caught Hamas off guard and led this to be even bigger than Hamas initially expected or even prepared for.
We've been looking at what's now really become infamous footage of Noah Argamani. She's since been returned safely. But just a little more context about the day itself. About 1,200 Israelis were killed on October 7th, over 200 people kidnapped and taken back to Gaza as a hostage. Some of those were taken as corpses. What did this do to the Israeli psyche at the time, Alone, and how did this lead into the type of response that the IDF had?
Israel was and is crushed. The Israeli psyche, the Israeli culture is, I would say, worse than the United States after 9/11. 9/11 was sort of a cataclysmic moment in the North American and specifically United States psyche, more also in the Western psyche. The idea that after the Cold War, we're going to have some sort of, you know, peace in our time, and all of a sudden everything returning in New York. Similarly, for Israel, Israel has a long history of wars. It has a long history of terror attacks. It sort of knows the score. However, over the years, has developed a sense of security. Has developed a sense of safety. The IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, along with the Mossad and the Shabak, which is the equivalent of Israel's just sort of FBI and CIA, are consistently the ones that receive the most amount of confidence when it comes to Israeli polling, more than Supreme Court, more than politicians, more than a lot of things. The Israeli Defense Forces, they will protect us. Israel can be safe because of that. Israel has survived wars with countries like Egypt. At the time, Egypt was the strongest country in the entire Middle East, arguably. Israel survived wars with Syria. It is now surviving, albeit with some casualties, but surviving barrages from Iran. Hamas is seen, and de facto is, not a state. It's not an army. It's a terrorist organization that theoretically the Israeli Defense Forces, the army, should have no problem defending the country from. The cataclysmic failure led to, first of all, a national sense of depression. Israeli psyche is completely crushed in terms of also the hopes that there's going to be some sort of resolution. The hopes for peace between Israel and the Palestinians have been crushed largely since the year 2000, the fall of the Oslo Accords. But if there was any restoration of that, that came crashing down. In addition to that, the sense of safety, the sense of home, has been completely shattered for a lot of Israelis. This is shown in a lot of things, not only in polls that are taken, not only in national surveys of psychology. It's shown in the amount of people that are leaving the country. There's scores of people that are simply saying the dream that they had of being safe here is just no more, and they want to leave. So the country's really not recovered from that. And one of the things that we have seen over the course of the year, and you and I actually spoke about it several times as the arc of it developed, is how the subject also became politicized. It became very politicized within Israel. What is the country's national priorities? Are the national priorities defeating Hamas, which, would be an understandable national priority for a country having suffered October 7th? Or is a national priority returning the hostages, even if that means ending the war and leaving Hamas alive, which others have argued is or should be the national priority for a country that wants to restore the citizens' faith that the country will always come and save you. So all that's in terms of what it did to the Israeli psyche. Now, in terms of how this structured Israel's response, the fact that October 7th was so monumental, it took Israel 3 to 4 days to even manage to resecure its borders and root out Hamas operatives that had infiltrated the country and were still holding on hostages inside the country itself, let alone in Gaza. The fact that the country was hit so hard had a lot to do, first of all, with the rhetoric. the inflammatory rhetoric that Israel's leadership was using, saying that they're going to starve Gaza out, saying that we are dealing with human savages. There's going to be absolutely no electricity or water or food entering the country. A lot of things that have now been brought as testimony against Israel in the International Court of Justice had to do with the national sentiment and the need to now have revenge. And with that, also, to large extents, the massive bombing campaign that we saw at the beginning of the war in northern Gaza, maybe I won't go as far as to say was solely motivated by vengeance. I think certainly that was one of the factors. But more than that, the massive bombing campaign was largely motivated by Israel's intense desire after October 7th to say we're not going to risk any more IDF soldiers. The bombing campaign made it, quote unquote, easier for IDF soldiers to go into northern Gaza and not get hurt. And that was Israel's priority, not invading and risking its soldiers. So I think that that had a lot to do with at least the beginning stages of the war, how the war was run, and how Israel was perceiving its relationship, so to speak, with the Gaza Strip and with the Palestinians in Gaza.
So we eventually get to a few weeks after October 7th. Israel officially begins its large scale ground offensive into Gaza. Airstrikes and some ground activity were already happening, but the IDF started its full scale operation up north at that point. They told Gazans to flee south. How did the world feel about this at the time alone? The October 7th attack, as we've been discussing, was fresh on the minds. People were angry, but were Israel's allies, like the US, fully on board?
The reactions of the world were mixed. On the one hand, like you said, it was very shortly after October 7th, and we had a parade of international leaders who were coming in and giving Israel support. Very famous hug between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu. I remind you, the two had a very fraught relationship. In the year before that, Biden was refusing to even meet with Netanyahu for a long time as a result of the judicial overhaul that Netanyahu's government was sort of pushing forward. All of a sudden, after October 7th, we had the world coming together to support Israel. And yes, largely, even though there was concern over Israel's actions, we saw a lot of the world, or at least Israel's allies, either turning a blind eye or actually supporting the idea that, okay, you're letting civilians evacuate the area. That means you're operating the way you're supposed to operate. However, we've also learned in recent times, we've seen different emails that were coming out within the Biden administration have been published in the last several weeks, showing that already then there was growing concern. Already then there were alarm bells going off within the administration and the State Department, different people saying, look, there's no way that this plays out without massive violation of international law. There's no way that this plays out without massive violation of international humanitarian law. So we saw on the one hand the world being supportive or at least accepting a lot of what Israel was doing, but warnings started to come up. But what we're learning is that actually internally within the different administrations and specifically within the United States, there was already grave concern then that agreeing to this now is going to lead to things escalating or deteriorating further and further, as we have seen to the point where even the United States, Israel's closest ally, was saying it's gone way too far.
So, October turns to November. The IDF's campaign continues south. Strikes around hospitals happen, strikes at schools happen, civilians are dying, and so are Hamas terrorists. Those terrorists have largely embedded themselves in tunnels and in some of the most vulnerable parts of civilization, with people dying and the hostages still in captivity. Israel and Hamas eventually approving a deal. It was mediated by Qatar, Egypt, and the US, and it basically brought the exchange of 150 Palestinian prisoners for 50 hostages in Gaza. It also approved an agreement for a 4-day ceasefire in Gaza. The ceasefire commenced on the 49th day of the war. Looking back alone, does it feel like this was the most optimistic point in a year of war?
Yes, and I'll say even more than that. The initial deal, like you said, was for 50 hostages, in exchange each hostage for three Palestinian prisoners and a 4-day truce. However, the deal included within it that Hamas can quote unquote buy itself another day of a truce if it continues to release every day 10 more hostages, and Israel will in turn release 30 Palestinian prisoners. The truce continued. It actually went 6 days, and there were a total of 81 Israelis who were released from captivity, alongside another 24 foreign nationals that Hamas had kidnapped on October 7th, seemingly inadvertently, and they were released without any negotiation of Palestinian prisoners for their exchange. Um, to that extent, the fact that both sides were willing to not only formalize an agreement between them to stop the fire and have some sort of release of Palestinian prisoners in exchange for Israeli hostages, and also the deal included a monumental increase in the entrance of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. But in addition to that, that both sides, seemingly for a moment, had a convergence of seeing the logic, seeing like, wait a minute, it's in our interest to release from Hamas's side 10 more hostages, specifically those were female hostages at that time. It's in Israel's interest to grant to the Hamas another day of a truce and release Palestinian prisoners, and both sides, without formalizing a new deal, just relying on the previous one and saying it can continue, let the deal continue for 2 more days, and it was even maybe going to continue for 3 more days. Hamas then said that they don't have 10 female hostages to deliver, and instead offered 7 female hostages and 3 elderly male hostages. Israel refused that, and thus the truce came crashing down. But to me, it's not only the reaching that deal, it's the fact that both sides were able to, quote unquote, see the light of, hang on, it's in our interest here to actually not resume fighting right away. Let's let this continue. That was one of the, brightest moments in what's happening in the war right now, and obviously securing the release of those hostages. We've had other moments in which there have been close to coming to a deal, but nothing, quite as that one moment at the end of November when both sides just agreed without renegotiating.
Yeah, the only other major thing that comes to mind is when they came to a agreement. It wasn't quite as hefty as the one we saw in November, but they did make an agreement to do those sporadic ceasefires because of the polio vaccination campaign that happened a
Absolutely.
little more recently. I got to ask you though, we talk about the Israeli hostages. They were exchanged for those Palestinian prisoners. What were those prisoners largely locked up for? Who were they?
So it's a good question because people often ask, so who are these Palestinian prisoners? What do we mean when we refer to them? So when Palestinian prisoners are discussed in the realm of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what that means is Palestinians from the West Bank, almost exclusively, although now we have another contingent from the Gaza Strip, who have been arrested, but they are arrested by the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. The Palestinians in the West Bank are under military occupation. That means that they do not have the same civil rights that Israelis have, and therefore, when they go to court, they're going to military courts, martial law. And it's a whole different set of laws and regulations that without any civil liberties and been criticized for, very little human rights as well. And then if they are found guilty, and I'll answer in a minute what they may be found guilty for, if they're found guilty, according to the regulations of Israel, they can still be imprisoned within Israel. In other words, even though they are actually found guilty by a military court in the occupied Palestinian territories, they can still be put in prison in Israel. And that's what sets them apart from quote unquote regular criminals within Israel's prisons because they are tried by a separate judicial system, separate laws, and just find themselves in the same jail as other criminals. What they are in jail for is a wide range of things. Historically, this was meant in order to stop terrorist attacks and violent activity of Palestinians against Israelis. So a lot of them are in jail for carrying out said violent activity. This includes, for example, Marwan Barghouti, probably the most famous and quote unquote heavy Palestinian prisoner. By heavy, we mean the one that has sort of the most prestige within the Palestinians, who was the leader of one of the more violent terrorist outfits during the Second Palestinian Intifada. He's in jail and he's a Palestinian prisoner. There are a lot of other Palestinian prisoners that are in jail for shooting attacks. At the same time, there are also a lot of Palestinian prisoners who find themselves in Israeli jails for a lot less crimes. Some of these can include stone throwing. Some of these can even include what's called membership in an illegal outfit. If you, according to some of the rules of martial law, for example, if you are a member of an organization and someone else in the organization violates the rules of guns and of gun possession. In other words, you are a member of an organization and someone else in the organization is found with a weapon, you can be found guilty of being part of an organization that wants to create sedition and be sent to a year in jail. It's martial law. So you have a wide range of Palestinian prisoners within Israel. What Hamas has done is ranked the Israeli hostages, how much each one of them is worth as far as the organization is concerned, and then demanded in exchange the amount of Palestinian prisoners, or their weight, the heavier Palestinian prisoners or the lighter ones. In the deal in November, who was released was Israeli female hostages. As far as Hamas is concerned, they are, worth the least amount because they're not considered soldiers by Hamas. And so the negotiation was the release of those 150, ended up being more because the truce was extended. Palestinian prisoners, the vast majority of them were in prison for relatively petty things. Anything from graffiti painting to, very, very minor assault on soldiers or stone throwing and things like that. However, Hamas has said in exchange for the hostages that Hamas considers more valuable, which are male hostages or IDF soldiers that are kidnapped, which Hamas considers the most valuable, they are going to demand many more Palestinian prisoners, and they're demanding the heaviest prisoners. Those are Palestinian prisoners that are in jail for running terrorist organizations, for committing mass acts of violence, sending suicide attackers. All of those are part of the Palestinian prisoners in Israel. I will say that I don't have the exact figure as of today, but as of 2 months ago, it was published that there are roughly 9,500 Palestinian prisoners held within Israel. So that is just to give some context of the amount of Palestinian prisoners versus hostages.
Palestinian prisoners will continue to be a topic of discussion as ceasefire talks continue into the future. Alon, we got to talk about the Iranian proxies. We're going to talk about Hezbollah a little bit later. I want to start with the Houthis right now. So, we, of course, know a lot about the Red Sea. We know a lot about all the havoc that the Houthis have caused. You're looking at damage done to a tanker. As we moved from November into December and January, the ceasefire was long gone. The IDF was continuing its way south in Gaza. Hamas battalions were being destroyed. But the Houthis in Yemen had been shooting at ships, causing havoc in the Red Sea, impacting the nation's, impacting the world's supply chain. And it got to the point that in January, the US and UK got directly involved. They conducted airstrikes against over a dozen Houthi targets in Yemen. My question is, do the Houthis still continue to cause havoc to this day? What type of havoc are they causing? And why can't they be stopped? They aren't exactly the beefiest militia, are they?
The Houthis are a very interesting actor within this arena. So just like, a moment of background, the Houthis took over large parts of Yemen starting in 2011, but really sort of came to the fold in 2014. That's when they took over a sizable part of Yemen, and when a war broke out between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia. They are an Iranian-backed militia who represent, as far as they're concerned, the Shiites in Yemen. Obviously, it doesn't mean that Shiites in Yemen support them. They claim to represent the Shiite population within Yemen. Now, they have always seen themselves as a mortal enemy of Israel and a mortal enemy of the United States. In fact, their slogan includes four things. Two of them are death to America and death to Israel. That is their motto. So it's not surprising that they chose to get involved in this. They also chose to get involved, I'll say, in another from another perspective, because they were dealing with a monumental internal crisis of their economy, and it really helps them that they now have an external enemy and that they have tens of thousands of people rallying in support of their attacks against Israel and against the United States. That was another reason they chose to get involved. Are they still wreaking havoc, causing trouble? Yes, unequivocally. The Houthis are one of the only ones in this entire conflict that have managed to detonate a suicide drone in Tel Aviv. They sent a drone from Yemen, making its way all the way across the Red Sea and detonating in the heart of Tel Aviv several weeks ago, killing one person in the middle of the night. They have also managed to detonate several drones in Eilat, Israel's most southern city. They have launched missiles that have, some of them managed to hit their targets in Israel, some of them not. They certainly are still a worthy adversary. Why are they so powerful? One, unlike Hezbollah in Lebanon and unlike Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis are in control of a vast territory, most of a desert territory. They have the capability of manufacturing, developing weapons, and hiding them in a way that Hamas and Hezbollah simply don't have. In Lebanon, Hezbollah does not control the entire country. It does not have the same capabilities to simply manufacture and store and develop weapons like the Houthis. The Houthis also control very, very important ports that go along the entrance to the Red Sea, and they are constantly resupplied by Iran and other countries with fuel that's necessary, with the equipment that's necessary. So that's that they have advantages over the other, militias that are in the area. In addition to that, it's simply not worth it for the different actors that are fighting the Houthis to really throw their weight into the fight. Israel, I don't need to, overemphasize that Israel's thrown its weight into fighting Hamas in the Gaza Strip. We now have seen that Israel's throwing its weight into fighting the Hezbollah in Lebanon. We have seen the United States and the United Kingdom throw their weight into trying to preserve the naval routes that the Houthis were blocking up the Red Sea, trying to preserve that as an open space to not disrupt international economy. We've also seen the IDF and the coalition led by the United States carry out airstrikes and strikes from sea at the Houthis. Nonetheless, this is far from going to destroy the Houthis' capabilities. For that, you really need the Houthis to agree to stop fighting. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to destroy every single missile. You're not going to be able to destroy every single drone. I don't know if you have footage. We've seen drones, their size, their sheer size. You're not going to be able to destroy every single drone. So eventually, you either come to a deal, or you have to have monumental ground invasion and throw your entire weight into the area. I will say that doesn't necessarily succeed either. Hamas fired rockets from northern parts of the Gaza Strip earlier tonight. So having ground invasion doesn't mean that you succeed necessarily doing everything, but you could have a chance at succeeding in that. So the Houthis are at a big advantage compared to the other militias because of all these things. Remains to be seen, though, what will happen if there is some sort of truce and ceasefire, or even just a dialing down of the situation with the IDF and other fronts. Attention to the Houthis may be turned. I don't think that the IDF is going to start landing troops in Yemen, but we might start to see the same level that the IDF is prepared to operate its air force or possibly naval units in other countries. We may start to see that in Yemen as well. We'll see how that develops.
And it was of particular interest, I remember back when the US and the UK got directly involved with those strikes on Yemeni territory. We got to talk about the civilians in Gaza alone. This is something that for much of this war has been an incredibly sad thing to watch. The humanitarian situation, it's been grim, to say the least. An unfathomable amount of people displaced, killed, food scarcities, illnesses like polio emerging. How important is the humanitarian piece of this when we tell the story of this past year?
The humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip is one of the main facets of this war, on many levels. It's one of the main facets because of the sheer amount of human suffering, and as human beings, we should care. So that's just on the personal level of what strikes people when they think about the war. Then there's also the fact that the humanitarian situation and the human suffering, on the one hand, is one of the things that exerts a lot of pressure on Israel from the international community. So Israel's not necessarily under any pressure to not fight Hamas, but it is under pressure to stop the humanitarian catastrophe. So in that sense, it's one of those facets. It also is one of the things that in Israel, there's a continuous hope that the absolute shattering of the Gaza Strip and of the way of life and ability to have normal life within the Gaza Strip is going to lead the Palestinian population in an uprising against Hamas. That is an open hope of Israel. There's even plans that are currently being considered within Israel with regards to the northern parts of the Gaza Strip in order to further try to sort of get Palestinian civilians angry in order to get them to see that Hamas is bringing nothing but death and destruction onto them. We started to see some signs of this several months ago we were seeing that there are actually nightly protests throughout the Gaza Strip of people who have been internally displaced that are protesting not only against Israel, but also against Hamas. Hamas has largely quelled those up until now, so we haven't seen a big movement develop, but it may be one of the things. That's in terms of, is it important, or like how is it important is when we tell the story? It's a major facet of the war. I will say though, in just looking at the development of the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, it's really gone through sort of three different phases in the war. And the first phase was in the first months of the when the war broke out, and then we saw the one of the more dire situations. Israel had completely cut off the access of all humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip. After a few weeks, was compelled by the United States to allow 20 trucks a day to come into the Gaza Strip, which is less than a drop in the bucket of what was needed at that time. We saw mass amounts of Palestinians internally displaced, all concentrating in the area that the IDF defined as a humanitarian zone, the Al Mawasi area down south. This brought about the spread of diseases, the complete lack of hygiene, clean water. You had basically over time 1.8 million people crammed into a refugee camp that in normal times did not have good infrastructure and was housing between 20 to 30,000 people. So that tells us something about the ability of people to actually carry on a healthy, normal life to any measure. That was the first months of the war, was one of the more dire situations. Then after the initial truce at the end of November, part of the truce was that there will be a substantial increase in the entrance of humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip, up to 200, 250 trucks coming in each day, and different deals that were developing. And the situation started to get a little bit better for about a month, for about a month to 2 months. And then in January, February, March, we saw the development of possibly the worst conditions in the Gaza Strip. A lot of different factors came together to produce that. It was the fact that the fighting had moved down south to Han Yunis, which meant that aid trucks had a much harder time as they entered through the Rafah crossing getting up north. It was the fact that Israel started to uncover that UNRWA, which is the main UN aid agency, some of its workers had participated in the October 7th attack, and Israel started to say it's not going to cooperate with UNRWA anymore, which led to a vast decrease in cooperation of distributing humanitarian aid. There were also a couple other factors, attacks against the police stations of Hamas, which meant that less aid trucks could come in. A bunch of things led to the fact that viewers may recall in February and March, we were hearing about famine. We were hearing about starvation that was developing in northern parts of the Gaza Strip, which led to different countries starting paradropping aid packages and doing all kinds of things, basically to bypass this deadlock that was being created. Then, unfortunately, there were two incidents. One was an aid truck incident in which, as a result of a lot of different things, over 100 Palestinians died as they were trying to get to aid trucks. I'm saying it that way because there's conflicting stories about what happened, and we can get into it, but just for the point, I'm just going to say, as a result of what happened. In addition to that, there was the killing of 7 workers of the World Central Kitchen, one of the biggest aid agencies in the Gaza Strip. These things came, well, they were killed, I'll say, by an IDF drone. These things came together and really made the United States compel Israel. The situation has to change. You cannot continue to ignore what is happening on the humanitarian side in the Gaza Strip. And since then, Israel opened up northern accesses to the Gaza Strip. It opened up the port of Ashdod to allow aid to come through Israel into the Gaza Strip. It was compelled to allow aid trucks to go from Jordan straight through Israel to the Gaza Strip. The situation is far from good, but that is the reason that we've stopped hearing about the starvation conditions and the development of famine and things like that in northern Gaza, because the situation has gotten, very, very incrementally better. But in that sense, Israel was forced to actually try to address this as part of how it's looking at the war. But then again, we still have a situation in the southern parts of the Gaza Strip, 1.8 million people still crammed into different refugee camps and with no basic human rights or humanitarian conditions, which is, leading to things like polio and things that we've seen in the last months. So sorry, I just had to cram all that into that question.
It's a complicated question. It requires a complicated answer, and it's an important part of the
Forgive
story.
me.
And let's just keep moving here because early 2024 saw the IDF continue its campaign south, destroying Hamas battalions. By late February, The Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry said 30,000 Gazans had been killed. Right now, that number stands above 40,000. It's important to mention, though, that that number does not distinguish between militants and civilians. Also in February, Biden publicly calls the IDF's campaign over the top. He kind of said it in a matter-of-fact way while he was giving a press conference. In early March, several countries start airdropping aid into Gaza. A first aid ship from Cyprus arrived on March 15th. Moving into April, on April 1st, those aid workers from the U.S. charity World Central Kitchen were killed in that IDF strike, the military calling it a tragic mistake. Israel faced a large amount of international pressure alone throughout the course of this war. The U.S. is Israel's chief ally. Is it fair to say that Israel has done a lot in the past year that the U.S. did not want it to do, yet Israel didn't face any serious blowback from the White House as a result? What say you?
I'd say two things to that. One, yes, there's no doubt that Israel has done a lot of things that really angered the US administration. I'll say that the majority of them actually may have less to do with the disastrous humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and the way the war was run, and may have more to do with the fact that Israel has not and has yet to develop a day after plan. It has yet to develop an exit strategy. It is not presenting anything that is going to be the future of the Gaza Strip and a way to end the war. Israel is fighting, seemingly, at least in rhetoric and in what it's put on the table, an endless war. The war can end with the destruction of Hamas. What does that mean? Does that mean killing anyone who has a Hamas flag, any Hamas, all Hamas fighting units? Does that mean that anyone who ever worked for Hamas in the postal service, because Hamas was the government? What does that mean? And after that, what happens? Does Israel just withdraw? Well, we've seen in the world, we've seen Afghanistan and Iraq, that doesn't work. To just go in, complete your mission as far as you're concerned, and withdraw. The fact that Israel has not developed a day after plan, has simply said that it refuses to have a Palestinian state, refuses to have a Hamas government, refuses to have a Palestinian authority, has been one of the things that has angered the United States the most. That, and in association with that, Israel's at times, I'm not going to say that it's the only one that's refused a hostage deal and a way to end the war. Hamas is an equal refusing partner in this, but the United States is more angry at Israel for that, because the United States would like to see Israel saying, we are willing to accept terms to end the war. Here are our terms, instead of just saying no, is unwilling to do that. Those are the things that Israel did that I would say angered the United States the most. Did it face consequences for them? It depends what we call consequences. We have seen a substantial increase in the United States criticism of Israel. Criticism may be seen as just rhetoric, but it actually has an effect. We saw the United States tell Israel, no, in December, when Israel was going to begin launching its campaign into Han Yunis, the United States says, you cannot and we will not support you in ordering a mass evacuation from Han Yunis the same way you did in northern Gaza. We cannot see another, at that time, 500,000 Palestinians being forcibly evacuated. That is something we're not going to support you in. Objectively, Israel did not do that. That meant much more complicated fighting for Israel and the loss of more soldiers because it couldn't carry out the same extensive, massive bombing campaign. But the rhetoric is important. Israel does ultimately tend to listen to the United States when it comes to the parameters the United States sets. There's a question of what parameters are being set, and is Israel really, suffering or feeling a blowback as a result of the parameters? That's a different question. But Israel has been curtailed at times in what it wanted to do in the war as a result of U.S. pressure. There are also times that Israel has not listened to the United States, or times that Israel has gone behind the United States' back. We saw this when it came to things like the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, or all kinds of different operations that, according to different leaks, Israel did not inform the United States before, informed it after the fact that the operation was already underway. The tangible things that Israel can be seen possibly as a blowback or a reaction have been a few times when the United States has said that it is withholding weapons shipments that would go to Israel. However, those were very, very minuscule, and most of the time were eventually released. However, the spirit of that, the fact that even the US is considering that, does have its effect as well. We have seen countries like Germany, countries like France, United Kingdom, all saying they are, some of them considering halting weapons shipments to Israel, some of them halting weapons shipments to Israel. The United States has not come to them and said, you're treating our friend badly. They've done this only in response to the change in rhetoric in the United States. So has Israel disappointed the United States when it came to some of its actions? Absolutely. Has it felt sort of the results of that or pushback from the United States? Not as tangibly as certainly could have been, but in some ways and to some extent, yes, it has had its impact on the war.
I'll ask you about the day after plan a little bit later on, but I got to ask you about the Gaza Health Ministry. They're the ones that provide these death toll numbers. And there's always been that looming question of, can you trust numbers from a Hamas run entity? What have you learned about those figures over time? And are those figures reliable?
It is one of the most controversial topics that is constantly brought up. Can you? Should you? A lot of people say even the UN revised its reliance on the figures that are coming out of the Hamas government. So I want to make sense of that. Thank you for asking. Um, the Palestinian Health Ministry in the Gaza Strip is a Hamas-run body. That said, it has proven itself historically throughout the different escalation rounds that Hamas had with Israel in 2009, 2014, 18, 21. Most of the time, their figures ended up, in hindsight, being relatively accurate. The reason is that the ministry actually counts, forgive the gruesomeness, counts bodies. That's what it does. It does not actually tend to publish how they died, what were the circumstances, who's to blame. Bodies that are brought through hospitals in the Gaza Strip are tallied by the Palestinian Health Ministry. To that extent, it has largely proven itself to be relatively accurate when it comes to reporting the figures of how many people have died. As you said, it does not distinguish between militants and civilians. It is counting bodies. What the United Nations corrected, and this is something that people say, well, didn't the United Nations say they're not trustworthy? The United Nations had been quoting the Palestinian Communications Ministry in the Gaza Strip. That is another Hamas-run body. They have proven themselves over the years to be completely unreliable. They have made up stories left, right, and center. They are the ones who, whenever there is an incident in the Gaza Strip, first and foremost publish X amount of people have been killed. That is wildly inaccurate. They have at times tried to come up with random explanations why their figures are much larger. The Palestinian Health Ministry, one of the things they've often said is because bodies vaporized and they disappeared. And that's why we said that this amount of people were killed, but the Palestinian Health Ministry is counting bodies actually cannot confirm that. So what the United Nations had been doing wrongfully was relying on the Palestinian Communications Ministry for the tally not of how many people were killed, of how many of those killed were women and children. It had been relying on the Palestinian Communications Ministry, and a few months ago, the United Nations did its own internal check and realized, yes, those figures are actually not reliable. It did not, though, call the Palestinian Health Ministry and the overall figures of how many people have been killed unreliable. More than that, I'll say something. Israel has never given its own tally of how many Palestinians have been killed in the Gaza Strip. Probably because Israel also just doesn't know, doesn't have on the ground intelligence of that, but it does have its own intelligence apparatus. At the end of March, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu gave an interview, and he said that he estimates, or that Israel estimates, that back then, roughly 13,000 Palestinian militants, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, had been killed in the Gaza Strip, and that Israel's estimates are that the ratio of militants to civilians is anywhere between 1 to 1, so one civilian killed for every militant, or 1 to 1.5. In other words, one civilian killed on average to 1.5. Sorry, one militant killed on average to every 1.5 civilian killed. If we use what Israel was estimating back in March, we come to a figure that Israel was saying 13,000 militants have been killed out of a total of roughly 26,000 to 32,000 people in the Gaza Strip. I went back and looked what was the Palestinian Health Ministry reporting that day. It reported roughly 30,500. So even Israel's estimates of how many people have been killed in the Gaza Strip was actually not different from the estimates of the Palestinian Health Ministry in that sense. So is everything they say 100% accurate? Do I take it, as do I take it as at face value as I would take, Western bureaucracy. No, they are also in the midst of a gruesome war. They don't have access to everything. At the same time, do I think that their estimates, that their figures largely do tell the picture of what is going on in the Gaza Strip? I've been looking at this war very, very closely, and I say, yes, I do.
Let's keep moving along the timeline. So, what we're looking at are familiar images. We just saw this happen within the past week or so, early, and I'll also just mention that April is when we first saw images like this. Iran targeting Israel directly instead of its proxies. So the second one just happened on October 1st. I'll ask you about both of these attacks at the same time. They both share a lot of similarities, don't they? Both happened in retaliation for Israel killing high profile figures in Iran proper. Both times, Iran took their shot at Israel and basically nothing came of it. The missiles were shot down or they simply didn't make it. What did we learn about Iran's capabilities from these two events alone? And maybe an extra question that's interesting on top of that one is, did Iran learn anything about Israel's defensive capabilities?
So I'll say a couple of things. First of all, with regards to looking at both attacks and the similarities between them, yes, both involved projectiles that were fired towards Israel at Israel. However, the attack in April involved the vast majority of them were drones, cruise missiles, and then a few ballistic missiles. Cruise missiles and drones from Iran take 8 to 9 hours to get to reach their target. You and I were speaking live while they were on their way. And at the time we were saying we don't know what Israel's plan is, but if you and I are looking at a camera and we're seeing sitting in your studio in my backyard, we're seeing the cruise missile on its way, chances are Israel also knows that it's on its way, and Israel's going to manage to intercept it. So the attack in April was much more of a show attack. The attack that happened just this week, um, different. This was, according to Israel, 180 ballistic missiles. According to Iran, it was over 400 ballistic missiles. Ballistic missiles are different. They, first of all, to travel from Iran to Israel take 10 to 12 minutes. It's very different in terms of the nature of the attack. The amount of explosives that they carry, each one of these missiles that we're seeing on screen was packing between 700 kilos and 1 ton of explosives, landing down, sort of like cascading down and ballistic missile style towards Israel. So, in that sense, this attack that happened just now in October was much more severe than the attack that happened in April. That said, the nature of the attack is very similar in as much as Iran very likely knew that the overwhelming majority of these missiles are going to be intercepted. They were not only intercepted by Israel, they were intercepted by Israel, the United States, Jordan, although Jordan didn't take full responsibility for interceptions this time, it did in April. And in April, there were reports on other countries, the United Arab Emirates, and possibly even Qatar, were all involved in the interceptions. What we learned about Iran's capabilities is, first of all, they've crossed the fear barrier, so to speak, of targeting Israel directly. Iran, for all of its rhetoric that has been going on essentially since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, had never attacked Israel itself. It was very good at saying that Israel must die and then sending other people to die in trying to attack Israel. But in April, for the first time, Iran crossed that quote unquote fear barrier and carried out an attack itself, signaling a new phase in the relationship of Iran and Israel and in the balance of power or balance of threats within the Middle East. From now on, no matter how this war ends, from now on, whenever there's a new development between Israel and somewhere along any axis that is allied with Iran, there is the danger that Iran will fire missiles in return. So, in that sense, that is one of the major lessons that we learned beyond its capabilities. Does Iran have greater capabilities than what it launched? Probably, but others have said, but Iran may have shown its cards that actually can threaten Israel, but can't actually do real damage with its current missile arsenal. What Iran learned about Israel's capabilities, I don't think Iran learned that Israel can intercept its missiles. Iran knew that. They have very good intelligence units. They knew what Israel is capable of. What they did learn, though, is that regional balance, which probably really disturbs them. they did see back in April that when push comes to shove, Jordan openly sent its air force to intercept missiles and essentially defend Israel from Iran. We also saw, like I said, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, possibly Qatar, the different Gulf countries, all of them fearful of Iran, all participating in the defense of Israel, right? If you think about that in the balance of power in the Middle East, that is a big development. That, I'll say, is probably what Iran learned and probably really angers the country. And we'll see how that may influence the relationship between Iran and those other countries once the situation dials down. Also, of course, everything we're all still waiting for Israel's retaliation. It was reported a few hours ago that on this night, between October 6th and October 7th, Iran has shut down all of its airspace between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. I put out a tweet about that saying, I don't know what's coming, but Israel shut down its airspace right before the Iranian attack. So maybe Iran's expecting a retaliation of Israel tonight, and maybe we'll see a completely different ball game as things develop. We'll see what Iran learned. But I think mostly what it learned is the new regional strange alliances that have forged as a result of these developments.
That's one of the tricky things about recording these interviews is that by the time we get them online, so much can develop and so much can change. That's something that you and I know all too well. Let's keep progressing down the timeline. Let's move to May. By this point, the IDF, which, remember, was working its way south, had made it to basically the southernmost point of Gaza. The city of Rafah came into focus. On May 7th, the Israeli army launches a ground offensive in Rafah, where a majority of the territory's civilians had by that point sought shelter, but it's also where the only Hamas battalions remained as well. The IDF went into Rafah, they destroyed tunnels like the ones we're seeing on screen, and they've since doubled back and ordered evacuations in other parts of Gaza again. They've gone back up north. Where do we stand on the IDF's progress eliminating Hamas alone? It seems that they've combed the entire strip, eliminated battalions, killed high-profile figures. How much of Hamas is even left? And I'll add another thing onto that. Where is Yahya Sinwar? Is he possibly still down in the tunnel? Is that what we expect, that he's still down in the tunnels? What do we know about Hamas's leadership and the state of the group as a whole?
So I'm going to correct one thing in that question, which also leads to the answer. When you say that the IDF launched the invasion into Rafah and that was the last Hamas battalions, actually, there are one or two battalions still remaining in the one area that the IDF still has not invaded in the Gaza Strip. The town of Dir al-Balah, which is the town in the central parts of the Gaza Strip. The way the IDF carried out its invasions in this war, it invaded the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, and then it did not progress linearly down south. Instead, the invasion of Han Yunis and Rafah came from the eastern side, from Israel. The IDF largely bypassed the central parts of the Gaza Strip, where, once again, the biggest city is Deir al-Balah, and there's also several very big Palestinian refugee camps, Al Bureij, Al Maghazi, and Al Sirat, a few others. The IDF has carried out a lot of airstrikes in those areas, has not invaded with ground troops into those areas in any meaningful way. It carried out operations there, as Nora Gamani and several more hostages were rescued by the IDF, but those were commando operations. It wasn't a full-on invasion like we've seen, and Hamas still, according to reports, has at least one or two battalions remaining in that central part of the Gaza Strip. So that's one thing about how close is the IDF to defeating Hamas. Hamas, according to reports, had 22 to 24 battalions that had been spread out across the Gaza Strip. The overwhelming majority of them, likely 21 to 22, have been dismantled. What does that mean, though? When we say a battalion has been dismantled, does that mean that every fighter is dead? No. What that means, according to the military, is the unit, the battalion, has ceased to operate as an organized military regiment. Instead, it has scattered. You have people with massive amounts of weaponry, guns, ammunition, explosives, and they are now fighting as individuals or as small units rather than operating as an organized army that Hamas has built. So the IDF has gone very far in dismantling the Hamas battalions, so much so that at the end of August, on August 21st, Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, actually publicly said that the Ezz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, the Hamas's military outfit has stopped functioning as an army, and that Hamas is now much more operating like guerrilla units that are scattered across the Gaza Strip. So, in that sense, the IDF has made vast progress in actually dismantling Hamas's battalions and Hamas's army. That said, the fact that you have scattering pockets of different fighters does not mean that the area is secure. On the contrary, you actually now have a situation where there is no organized command structure of the different fighters, and therefore there's also no one who could even, in theory, you know, or order people to lay down arms or issue different orders because the situation has become much more of a free-for-all. So that's in terms of dismantling Hamas's activity. One of the things we have seen in addition to this because of the lack of a day after plan, the lack of any implementation of a plan for governance in the Gaza Strip, what we have seen throughout the Gaza Strip. The IDF invaded the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. Then, at the end of December, it pulled its forces out of the north and it moved most of its forces down to Han Yunis. What happens in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip at that point? There's a complete power vacuum. The only ones that are capable of reassuming governance are the Hamas bureaucrats. So what we've seen is Hamas starting to rebuild every time the IDF pulls out of somewhere. The IDF pulled out of Han Yunis on April 7th. Within days, Hamas is setting up its police units. It's not setting up necessarily its military again, but it's setting up its police units, its governing apparatus, its different bureaucrats and administrations that are in charge of trying to restore peace and order, building itself up again to be the governing party in the area that the IDF evacuates every single time. The IDF evacuates an area, Hamas starts to reassert its governance in that area, which is the main criticism that Israel is facing. Okay, you defeat Hamas, but what do you do next? Because without that, we have seen the IDF just today, October 6th, the IDF launching a massive operation in Jabalia refugee camp in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip in Gaza City, pulling units out of Rafah, out of the fighting in Rafah, to again fight in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip because Hamas is rebuilding its governance there. According to some reports, it has developed the administration so far that it has even started to rebuild its weapons manufacturing capabilities because its bureaucrats are now reestablishing themselves in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. So, how far is the idea of going in defeating Hamas's military capabilities? It has had a lot of successes. How far is it going in actually defeating Hamas and making sure that the Hamas government does not come back and restore itself? So far, we haven't seen great success on that front. The big question, where is Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas? He was the leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Now he's the leader of Hamas throughout the entire movement. No one knows. There were speculations in the last several weeks that because he hasn't made contact with the organization for a while, possibly he was killed in an IDF bombing. The IDF went out of its way to say, actually, we don't know that. So if he was killed in an IDF bombing, it was done by chance, that it wasn't any specific attempted assassination. That said, just a few days ago, there was a report, I believe in the New York Times, saying that the military intelligence in Israel and the United States believe that Sinwar is still alive. Where is he? Is he in one of the tunnels in Han Yunis or in Rafah, or is he possibly in Deir al-Balah or in the humanitarian area? We don't know. That, the IDF seemingly does not know. I certainly am not going to guess. But it does appear that he is alive as of now, and probably still calling the shots, however he has managed to do it throughout the entire war.
So, something that you and I talk about offline often is the fact that there's one big piece of this conflict that feels like it's underreported on: the West Bank. What's been the story of the West Bank over the past 12 months?
The West Bank is an insanely complicated arena unto itself. It is a strip of land that is governed by three different administrations. Some of it is administered by the Palestinian Authority, which is a sort of quasi-autonomous entity of a Palestinian government. Some of it, the majority of it, is administered by direct occupation of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, and some of it, what's known as Area B, is a hybrid administration of the Palestinian Authority in charge of some matters, the IDF in charge of others. This means chaos. This means, to large extents, a lot of lawlessness because you commit a crime in one area that, if we're talking about pertaining to the war, a crime that involves terrorism, gun running, weapons manufacturing, you flee into another area. All of a sudden, who's going to arrest you? Who has an interest in arresting you, even? What laws are you subject to? it's a disaster when it comes to jurisdiction, when it comes to actually enforcing the law. As a result, over the years, there's been a lot of lawlessness and the development of different sort of almost warlord style organizations within the West Bank. On October 7th, 2023, when the attack is launched from the Gaza Strip, Hamas calls upon the Palestinians in the West Bank to rise up in arms. This absolutely terrifies Israel. The West Bank is a lot more mixed in between Israeli settlers and Palestinians. It's a lot easier to carry out a lot of attacks. It's very close to main Israeli cities, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv. As a result, Israel launched a massive crackdown throughout the West Bank, and we've seen spirals and cycles of violence continuing every day. We have seen over 70 or 80 division-wide operations that the IDF has carried out. These are pictures that you're showing from the West Bank. It's not the Gaza Strip of the IDF carrying out operations in the hearts of Jenin, Tulkarem, sometimes Bethlehem, operations in Jericho, where the IDF had not carried out operations for a long time. Throughout Hebron, the entire array of Palestinian cities have seen massive IDF operations to crack down on the possibility of Palestinian uprising and violence and terrorism, either style October 7th or not, emerging from that area. In addition to official IDF activity, there's also been a lot of violence both from Palestinians and from Israeli settlers. This has been the bloodiest year in the West Bank since the Second Intifada, since that's the beginning of the 21st century. There are close to 700 Palestinians that have been killed by both IDF operations and clashes with the IDF and by Israeli settler attacks. A lot of them were militants, a lot of them were not. There have been scores of Israelis that have been injured and killed by Palestinian attacks. The area is a powder keg that is constantly waiting to erupt. One of the main facets involved is that the governments and administrations on both sides are not contributing to spiraling things down. The Palestinian Authority, on the one hand, is vastly cooperating with the IDF to try to quell violence. On the other hand, it also has a limited interest to be seen hunting down Palestinians in order to keep Israelis safe, especially as everyone's seeing Hamas is trying to fight the IDF. The Palestinian government is helping the IDF. So they're in a bind in that sense. The Israeli government, different elements within the Israeli government are extremely right-wing. Bezalel Smotrich, Itamar Ben-Gvir, these are people that have called upon the IDF to absolutely enact far more violence in the West Bank. These are people that sit in cabinet. They have called on Israel to annex the West Bank and thereby incorporating it into the country, but not give Palestinian citizenship, which would be very complicated when it comes to international law. So the leaderships on both sides are pouring a lot of fuel onto a powder keg, and everyone's constantly scared. When is someone going to throw the match? We thought this would happen in Ramadan. Surprisingly, it did not this year. You and I were talking and we were saying we're looking to it. Actually, it was one of the more peaceful Ramadans that happened, which is very surprising. Maybe that'll continue, although we are coming up on the Jewish holidays now. We'll see what'll happen, but it's a constant fear in the war.
Speaking of constant fear, a lot of people have been keeping their eye on the situation up north in northern Israel and in southern Lebanon. This has really been the focus of our coverage the past few weeks here. Hezbollah has become a key focus of the wider conflict at hand. I want to zoom out. I want to think big picture with this one. Did Hamas's attack on October 7th basically, in an indirect way, give Israel an excuse to crush Hezbollah alone?
So Hezbollah is an interesting actor within this array. Like I said, on October 7th, Hamas called upon all forces to join in the attack on Israel. Hezbollah seemingly answered the call, and on October 8th last year, launched its monumental barrage of rockets and missiles and started launching these missiles and rockets every day in support of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. At the same time, Hezbollah really did not want to take part in this war. Hezbollah was, to put it bluntly, angry with Hamas that they did not coordinate their attack with them. Hezbollah had been building up its own commando units in order to carry out an October 7th style attack, and they sort of had the element of surprise taken away from them. And in response to that, Hassan Nasrallah, the former leader of Hezbollah, gave a speech right at the beginning of the war saying, we'll support Gaza, but the war is 100% Palestinian. The war is not ours. In that sense, for the majority of the year, there's been this sort of like push and pull between Hezbollah and the IDF, with both sides agreeing that there's going to be rockets and missiles launched, and the IDF is going to carry out a limited amount of retaliations, and that's where things are going to end. However, over time, this started to spiral and take on a life of its own. And that's what we're going to talk about when we get to how we got to the current IDF invasion of Lebanon. But in that sense, did this give Israel an excuse to destroy Hezbollah? You could look at it that way, but the truth is, Israel has tried desperately not to. Both Hezbollah and Israel have tried desperately to keep this on a very low level, each attacking each other for the first 10 months of the war, but not letting it get out of hand. The situation got out of hand, seemingly as a result of that Hezbollah missile at the end of July that killed 12 kids, youth, in northern Israel, landed in a playground essentially in northern Israel. After that, things started to spiral and the dynamics took off on their own. Israel carried out the assassination of Fuad Shukr, the sort of chief of staff of Hezbollah. Hezbollah started to launch much heavier rockets and missiles towards Israel, some of them causing a lot of damage in Israel. Israel started to carry out much more larger attacks in Lebanon. Then this also coincided with the spiraling down in the Gaza Strip. Like I said at the end of August already, Israel defense minister says that the situation in Gaza Strip is quote unquote under control in the sense that Hamas's fighting battalions have been dismantled, or the majority of them have been dismantled. And Israel starts to divert its attention more towards the north. And then the situation again started to spiral more and more. The pager attack, the walkie-talkie attack, Hezbollah launching more and more missiles, actually trying to carry out a massive retaliation against Israel with reportedly 6,000 missiles. Israel largely curtailed this, fired towards the central parts of the country, all culminating in Israel carrying out major assassinations, chief among them of Hassan Nasrallah, and now the current invasion. So it's sort of developed and worked out that Israel now has the excuse to try to attack Hezbollah. But even when you said has it given Israel the excuse to crush Hezbollah, Israel has made public it is not fighting a war right now to destroy Hezbollah. Unlike the rhetoric about Hamas, that the war is not going to end until Hamas is destroyed, Israel has publicly said Hezbollah must be pulled north of the Litani River. That means pulled north about 8 miles, 10 miles, at points 20 miles. I mean, it depends where, from the border with Israel. So Israel's fighting a war right now just to push Hezbollah back away from the border in order to allow the safe return of the Israelis that have been evacuated from the northern parts of Israel and sort of make sure that Hezbollah can't pull off its own October 7th. The situation developed and spiraled into this. This was not something that neither Israel nor Hezbollah seized as an opportunity way back in October. It just took on a life of its own about 10 months into the war.
I got to ask you about domestic issues within Israel. This has become another focus just about every weekend. We're seeing these images. They still continue. Protests have become commonplace in Tel Aviv. These are largely protests that are calling for an immediate hostage deal. These protests have become more anti-government as the months wear on. How is the government responding to their own citizens alone? Is this domestic pressure meaningful?
It is meaningful, but for this we have to remember that the war breaks out at the end of a year of massive protests that are going on in Israel. The current government is the most hawkish right-wing government essentially that Israel's ever seen, and when it was put into power back in December 2022, immediately, within less than a week, in January of 2023, the government announced that it is going to carry out a massive, what it called judicial reform, the critics call judicial overhaul, which would basically have led Israel down a big path of what we call democratic backsliding, essentially giving the government the power to override the Supreme Court and making Israel, to large extents, less of a country with a lot less checks and balances on the government. This led to the largest protests in Israel's history. At times, we saw 600, 700,000 people out in protests in Israel, which the equivalent to the United States would be several million people going out and protesting overnight. The government responded to these really by dismissing them, but also by showing fear, and it constantly kept on pushing back the judicial overhaul and the judicial reform. Then the war breaks out. Initially, the protests were called off because also the judicial overhaul was called off because of the focus on the war. But after a while, we started to see the protests coming up, both from those that were saying the government is incompetent, it's running the war with an eye to politics and what's going to look good politically, combining with those that were calling upon Israel to secure a hostage deal, focusing, like I said at the beginning, the priorities of the war should be returning the hostages, not the amorphic destroying Hamas. The priorities should be actually returning the hostages, and the government should sign a hostage deal. These protests over time came together, which is why, like you said, we've seen protests every week, and the people here are raising their arms and they're talking about a, come to a hostage deal, bring the hostages home. However, these have often become sort of akin with protests saying the government must go. The government is actually not cooperating for the good of the people. Because this comes already in a moment when the country was extremely polarized and there were massive protests every weekend in the same place, sometimes by the same organizations that were calling for the government's replacement. These have very much become politicized also. Calls to return the hostages are often seen as calls to replace the government. So these things do have meaningful consequences in terms of the polarization in the country and the politics that are involved. Thus far, though, they have not actually had a lot of impact in changing the government's policies, with the exception of one thing: the defense minister, Yoav Gallant. Prime Minister Netanyahu hates Yoav Gallant with a passion. He sees him as a political threat. He sees him as someone who has not shared his goals in the war. There are often leaks from cabinet that, according to other leaks, Netanyahu suspects Gallant as being the main source of the leak. And Gallant is the one that has said, we need to push for a hostage deal at the expense of other things in the war, while Netanyahu wants the other things in the war to be first priority. However, Netanyahu has threatened time and again to fire the defense minister. He has openly said, I have no faith in him. And yet he has not. And he has not, among others, because when he tried to fire him before the war, back in March, there was a spontaneous outburst of the protests. 700,000 people took to the streets overnight. The country went on general strike. And as a result, he rescinded that attempt. So the government is not bending to this pressure on the one hand. On the other hand, Netanyahu would really like to fire Gallant. He's made this public, and it may happen in the coming weeks. He sort of laid the groundwork already. However, that has not been done, I would argue, out of fear of these protests.
So we're going to wrap up here in a moment. I want to ask you the question that perhaps is the biggest thing moving forward here. Truce talks. They've been failing recently. This war has no end in sight. How does a war like this end? What are the possibilities? The U.S. says it's in favor of a two-state solution, but we all know that the path to getting there is a huge question mark. In your opinion, is there enough public high-level discussion about how this thing ends, about what happens after all of this?
I think that there's a lot of discussion. I think that most of it gets stuck in the difference between theory and practice. I think that very often we see a lot of people in the highest of levels in the United Nations, in the different in the European Union, in the United States, all talking to Israel and talking to Palestinian leaders, agreeing sometimes on the macro, but not having absolutely no plan for the implementation. And then you have others that talk solely about implementation and have no vision for the macro, saying that the war should end now, which Israel again has said, as far as it's concerned, Hamas has to be destroyed and the hostages returned and the war can end. And some of the ceasefire proposals have also said, and there will be a complete ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, but they end there. That's focusing on implementation. That's not saying, and then what happens? What's the macro? Is there negotiation to a two-state solution? Is it a one-state reality? Is there a situation where we go back where there is Israel and a Hamas government that's under siege? There's no vision there on the macro and only focused on the process. In turn, a lot of the talk is about the macro, support for a two-state solution. Lots of people in the world support a two-state solution. What does that mean? Does that mean a complete Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank also? Does that mean one government between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip? Whose government? Hamas says it's our government. The Palestinian Authority says it's our government. Does this entity have an army? How is Israel's security guaranteed? to suggest that Israel, which was not in favor of a two-state solution last year at this time, to suggest that, a day later, October 7th happens, now Israel should, have public support for granting the Palestinians their own state is simply not going to happen without actually thinking about the process, actually thinking about how is trust going to be built between the sides? How are you going to guarantee Israel's security? Not just saying two states and Israel's security guaranteed, but actually the process, and also how you're going to guarantee Palestinians' human rights and civil rights, not just saying, and Israel will respect that, but what is the process to actually getting there? So the problem is there is a lot of talk, but the talk is either the macro vision or the process, and very rarely are people talking about an actual plan for a process with a vision. What will happen? Obviously, I don't know. And if you like I often say, I have studied Hamas for years. If you asked me 2 years ago, can Hamas pull this off? I would have said probably not. So I'm certainly not going to give predictions as to what is likely to happen. I will say that very often we have seen in circumstances like this in the world, but also in the Israeli-Palestinian process conflict, that things dial down towards a stalemate. And as a result of that stalemate, you end up with hybrid situations. That is largely what happened after the Second Intifada. Second Intifada, Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization were negotiating during Oslo in the 1990s. There was a vision and a process that was coming towards a two-state solution that came crashing down in the year 2000. There was no agreement on what happens after that. The Oslo Accords officially expired in the year 2000, yet Israel and the Palestinian Authority are still abiding by them in the West Bank. There's no agreement on what happens now, yet they're still living according to that. Similarly, when Hamas took over the Gaza Strip in 2007, there was no deal between Israel and Hamas. There was for a brief period, but since then, there's no deal. The two sides just somehow agreed that there's going to be a siege and Hamas will fire rockets, Israel will retaliate, then they'll go back to the state of calm. Neither one of them recognize each other, yet they managed to work together on border issues, on UN aid coming in, on what's happening. That is the way these things sometimes happen when there's no actual moment of end and agreement. Things just devolve and develop. So without any sort of critical change all of a sudden, if the United States all of a sudden says enough's enough, we're going to stop our support for Israel unless it does something, or Yahya Sinwar is killed and somehow there's a revolution in Gaza, like without like a monumental change, if things are just allowed to devolve into their own, chances are, unfortunately, we're going to see the situation just come into status quo, whereby there is IDF presence in the Gaza Strip and there's constant fighting without an actual agreement at any given point until there is that critical change, until there is that something that manages to shift attention on both sides, get them to some point of agreement. That's not going to happen with the situation in Lebanon. In Lebanon, we are probably going to see an agreement and a resolution between the sides. In Gaza, unless something surprising happens, which might, this entire war has been surprising. But if the situation continues on the trajectory it's in, we're probably just going to see a devolvement into a status quo, and eventually, possibly with regime change in one of the sides, or possibly as a result of regional pressure, we'll see some sort of process developing. But until then, we're going to see the status quo.
We wanted to cover a lot of ground today. It's impossible to cover all of it, but in the time we've been recording this alone, it's turned from day to night behind you. Before I let you rest your voice, tell us about your YouTube channel. You post daily war updates, and you have some special stuff coming up for your October 7th coverage, correct?
This was not my plan. Essentially, what happened is because I studied the conflict, when October 7th happened, I was getting way too many phone calls. People asked me what's happening. So I said, okay, let me just record something. I'll record a 5-minute thing tonight, tell people what's happening. I started doing that for a week. That turned into a nightly summary of what's happening in the war. And that is what I've been doing almost every day. I did it every day for 6 months, and now I do every 2 or 3 days to update on the highlights. What I am doing, again, like you said, there's just too much to cover. So I'm uploading 4 segments tomorrow. One of them covering the hostage situation, what has been, how many people were kidnapped, how many have been killed, how many were released, when they were released, in order to try to make some sense of that. A report on the fighting in the Gaza Strip, what have been the different stages. the humanitarian situation. I'm going to dive a little deeper into what we talked about here. And then one video, which God help me, I'm going to try to talk about the entire regional aspect, how Hezbollah got involved, the Houthis, Iran. That is what I'm going to have to rest my voice in before, but that is going to be at least my attempt to summarize this first year of war.
And we appreciate you joining us as often as you do. And we will be talking to you on TV soon, Alon. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.